Welcome to the fourth and last lecture in our course on mindfully facing climate change. And as I promised in the last lecture, in this lecture I want to show the liberating potential of facing climate change. In the earlier lectures, I have tried to relate the teachings of early Buddhism to environmental concerns. But now I want to do in a way the other way around. I am bold enough to argue that mindfully facing climate change can actually be a path to awakening. And to establish this idea, I rely on a discourse called the Discourse on Seven Suns. And this sets out with the following passage. And this description then sets the basic theme of impermanence and impermanence leading to disenchantment, dispassionate, and liberation is then fleshed out with the following description. So this, in a way, complements the description of flooding and inundation that we had in the first lecture. This is a destruction of the world through the fire element. And first stage here, no rain and everything starts to wither up. But the situation gradually gets worse. So here we have this idea of several suns, up to seven suns appearing. And as far as I'm able to tell, this discourse is not a parable. It is meant to describe something to be taken fairly literal. But again, in order to make sense out of this, we have to avoid too literal an interpretation. And in the ancient times, numbers had a more symbolic function than they have today. And so, as a way of interpretation, without pretending that this must have been necessarily the original idea, my suggestion is to understand this to mean an increase in heat. That in the ancient setting, maybe the idea of additional suns was more easily understood, and that is why it was employed. But that I would read this passage as meaning there's a certain degree of heat that was kind of normal in the ancient Indian setting, and so this is becoming up to 7 times as much. So here we see how the seventh sun, the increase of heat, is such that the whole earth is on fire. So this illustrates the conflagration is of such type that everything is burned up completely and nothing remains, comparable to oil that is burning and no ashes remain. And I think this is interesting that it has, to some degree, a parallelism with what nowadays we know about the future destiny of the planet Earth. That at some point the sun will increase, the heat will increase, and eventually this whole planet is going to be burned up. I'm not saying this in a way to pretend that already in ancient India the Buddha knew what we now know from modern science, but just to point out that there's an interesting parallelism in these descriptions, and that this, even though expressed in terms of seven suns, that this basic idea can be taken serious. But even apart from that ultimate destruction of the whole earth by, in the discourse, seven suns, what remains of direct relevance to us is even the stage of just two suns. So, with two suns in the way this discourse is describing it, we would already be at a point where human life would no longer be possible on this earth. And this is precisely what we are talking about with climate change. With the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, with the global warming increasing, and then we have the problem of the Arctic ice melting and increasing release of methane. There's chances that much sooner than we would think we might reach a condition on Earth where the climate becomes such that the continuity of human life is endangered. And so, taking it from that perspective, the discourse on seven suns gives a message that is directly related to the current situation. But it gives that message from the viewpoint of progress to liberation. So, the whole purpose of this dramatic description of destruction, which with all seven suns together is much worse than anything we would expect to happen from climate change, the message is impermanence. Impermanence, the topic that we already touched on in the first lecture with the elephant footprint discourse, and the realization that nothing is going to remain. There's nothing that is really permanent. Human civilization, even this whole planet, will be destroyed at some point in the future. And so this is meant to lead to disenchantment, dispassion, and liberation. And I think the important point here is that the vision of total distraction can be an important tool to progress to awakening. And in saying that, it is at the same time also an important tool to becoming active. There's an important distinction here to be made between equanimity and indifference. The vision of total destruction of the earth is not meant to lead to fatalism. And we can easily illustrate that with the idea of the mortality of our own body. There's a practice that I will be talking about later about recollection of death to help us to become more aware and to take home the truth that our body is mortal, that we will die. But the realization of that, of course, doesn't mean that we stop eating, stop drinking, no longer take medicine. The point is only that we do whatever is possible to sustain the continuity of the body in the awareness that at some point, sooner or later, that will no longer be possible. And we have a similar topic also in the awareness found in several discourses that the Buddha's teaching is going to disappear at some point in the future. That is being thematized repeatedly, and every time it comes with very clear instructions on what to do to prevent that happening too soon. So the same thing here is facing the end of human civilization is not meant to lead us to a position where we say, oh, I don't care. That would be a serious misunderstanding. But it is meant to teach us how to face that and then do whatever we can to avoid that this happens too soon. And I can add from my own experience that for me in facing climate change, the first step was really to let the vision of a total end of human civilization really sink in and find a place where I could face that, accept it. And it is from that ability to face it that I can now step out and be active and do whatever I can to counter those developments that threaten to lead to the end of human civilization. And this is basically then a win-win situation, you might call it. Because it is, for me, it gives me the foundation, really the foundation for being able to dedicate myself wholeheartedly, but with equanimity, to facing climate change. And at the same time, it also is an inspiration to practice with the view that everything is impermanent, everything sooner or later is going to fall apart. And I think this win-win situation from my own personal practice is really what inspired me to do the course that we're doing here now, to write the book and to develop these meditations. And actual meditation that I would like to introduce for this topic relates to mindfulness of breathing. It is the last 4 steps of mindfulness of breathing. So this is, the breath is anyway an impermanent phenomenon. And so this invites us to pay attention in particular to the fact that the breath is nothing but change. It is impermanent. And this contemplation of impermanence then leads on to contemplating dispassion. Dispassion in the sense of letting go of attachment to what is anyway changing. And the more we become dispassionate, the more our attachments diminish, the more we find we will be at ease with cessation, with the ending of things. And all of this culminates in letting go of all unwholesome type of reactivity. That was just a first preparation. I will later talk again about the actual meditation practice. But now it's really time for me to get into what is the actual really topic of this lecture, which is the Eightfold Path. The fourth truth is about the Eightfold Path, and in the first part of this lecture, I hope I have been able to establish that my right to apply the Eightfold Path to climate change based on showing that facing climate change has a potential of leading to awakening. So now let us look at the Eightfold Path in more detail. So this is a list of the 8 path factors as a first introduction, and it shows how they all build on each other. Right view is the foundational input, the directional input that leads to intentions that are streamlined accordingly. And based on this directional input by these two, we have speech, action, and livelihood informed by this perspective. And this ethical foundation building then leads over to meditative cultivation of the mind, making an effort to emerge from what is unwholesome and establish what is wholesome, cultivating mindfulness, and concentrating, collecting the mind. This is only one perspective on the dynamics of the Eightfold Path, this sequential presentation. There's also another one. So this passage tells us that right view is the precursor in a way. It comes first. And here it has the task of distinguishing wrong intention and right intention from each other. And it fulfills the same function for the other path factors. In principle, in the early discourses, we have two types of descriptions of right view. One of these lists a series of different types of wrong views that one does not take on. And these have to do with the denial of the efficacy of making offerings, denial of any obligation towards one's parents, denial of the meaningfulness of any kind of spiritual practice. And particularly interesting is this one part in this standard definition which says there is no fruit or result of good or bad deeds. And this wrong view refers to karma, the idea of karma in early Buddhist thought. So right view is the affirmation there is a result of good and bad deeds. But I think this aspect of right view can also be taken out of its original context and be applied to the current situation in the sense of encouraging us to take responsibility for what we do, to see that there's a result of what I'm doing and I have to take responsibility for that. The other of the two definitions of right view invokes the Four Noble Truths. So that is precisely what we are talking about here. This is the scaffolding for the whole course. So it means dukkha has to be penetratively understood, which in the way I am presenting matters here means that we need to really understand our relationship and dependency on the body, on the earth, on the whole environment. And the second truth, craving, needs to be eradicated. Here, this is in particular the three root defilements that we need to overcome: greed, hate, and anger, and delusion. The third truth is liberation, which needs to be realized. And I think for the gradual development of the final liberation, the kind of temporary liberation we can realize more easily in our step-by-step approach is the Brahma Viharas. And the fourth truth is to be cultivated. This is the Eightfold Noble Path, and this is what we are right now talking about. How to put it all into practice. So, from the distinction between what is wholesome and what is unwholesome enshrined in right view, we now come to right intention, the intention of being free of renunciation, contrast to sensual desire, which is immediately evident in relation to climate change, the need for all of us to separate wants from needs and to see where we can diminish our carbon footprint. And then the intention of ill will and cruelty or harming, to have the opposites is to cultivate metta and compassion. And this is again, these are really key qualities for any kind of environmental activity. So this passage shows us how to actually move from wrong intention to right intention. And it shows the collaborative effect of three path factors. You remember earlier we had this sequential building up. Now we get a different perspective. We have right view as to knowing what is wholesome, what is unwholesome. Then there is right effort to get out of the unwholesome and establish the wholesome. And there's mindfulness, and she's monitoring. She's monitoring the whole thing, giving feedback all the time. And it is in this sense that right view, right effort, and right mindfulness, they kind of circle around each of the other path factors. So it is not that we have to say to have mindfulness, we have to first of all establish the other six. The sequential presentation we had earlier just shows how they all line up one after the other. But even for the first one and the second one, the third one, we need mindfulness because they collaborate. So this describes the different types of wrong speech that should be avoided. The most important one is, I think, the first one about false speech, that we really need to stay with the truth. And this has several dimensions. It is very important in the current situation that we speak the truth, that we let other people know the seriousness of the situation, because there's a lot of misinformation around. But it's also important not to overstate it. We can see now on the internet sometimes there are some prophets of the apocalypse who exaggerate and overstate in order to wake up people. And that is also not the way. It should really be a clear reliance on a scientific knowledge to stick with truth and to avoid partisanship, malicious speech, and harsh speech, even being face to face with those most responsible for environmental destruction. It should still be possible for us to be equanimous and understanding. And gossip, not to keep chit chatting about this and that. I think a way of bringing it in is to find gentle ways of bringing this topic in any kind of situation. I mean, just a silly example, I recently was at the dentist. And so when he was getting ready, he said, "You tell me if anything bothers you." I said, "Yeah, there's something that bothers me, climate change." And they were all laughing. But it was just a way of bringing in that topic and then seeing if there was some openness. And after the treatment was over, he came to ask me about some reading material, and I recommended something for him to be better informed. So there's ways of just bringing in that topic and trying to let it let there be awareness of that, but then also seeing if the others are open to it or not. And in terms of communication about climate change, it is particularly important, and we have a lot of research that just going into catastrophism is not very helpful. If we describe the situation too extreme, people just become numb and they switch off. So there has to be a lot of mindfulness and fine tuning to see exactly in what way it is best to express things so that the others stay receptive, and to always have a positive vision, to give people something to do. So that's not just like everything is horrible, everything is falling apart, and then just dropping that on others and let them sit with it. But to show, look, there's a problem here, but this is what we can do. And this is the potential. To have really mindfulness of those who are listening when we communicate about climate change. Yeah, I think this is quite straightforward, and there's not much I need to say. Killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, just avoiding actions that are harmful in this way. And in a broader sense, action, I would also take it to mean that within the range of our possibilities, it's good if we can become active. One crucial thing is that all of us go to vote. Here in the States, we have almost half of the population who could vote is not even going to vote. And this, of course, then is a reason why we end up with a government with which many of us are not particularly happy. So it is, I think, for everybody in these times, really a matter of responsibility to vote and to be aware of where those people we vote for in the elections, where do they stand as far as environmental destruction is concerned. And another one is also activism of different types to manifest, to communicate that the situation here needs to be addressed in some way. So this is a description of wrong livelihood taken from the life of a monastic, and so I have here another passage that describes the same for lay people. I think the principle here is quite clear. All of these trades that a layperson should not engage in are harmful, or at least most of them. So it's the absence of harm that we could take as the main theme. And this then could be employed to broaden the scope of livelihood in the general sense that we try to live with at least harm to others and to the environment. This is something I already briefly touched on in an earlier lecture, that our own avoiding harm to the environment, diminishing our carbon footprint, it stands on its own by being our own embodiment of our ethical integrity and being our mindfulness practice. The question is not, does the whole world change if I do such and such thing? Will carbon emissions, greenhouse gas be much less if I don't do this and that? The question is simply, is this the way I think things should be done? Is this the way that accords with my own understanding, my ethical sensibility? my taking of responsibility, which, as I said earlier, I would be bold enough to say that this is an aspect of right view, and my mindfulness practice. So, if interpreted in this way, the aspect of livelihood can have a very broad dimension. So this is the definition given of right concentration. We had right effort and right mindfulness earlier as monitoring the other path factors. But right effort basically is whenever we make an effort to emerge from the unwholesome and cultivate the wholesome. And right mindfulness is, I think, of all the different things I said in these lectures, probably the most important, crucial quality, this monitoring ability and observing what's happening. And that leads on and forms the basis for concentration. And here concentration, right, becomes right by being based on the other path factors. And in the approach that I have presented here, this is particularly the cultivation of compassion we did in the last lecture. So in terms of actual meditation, the idea is to do the earlier practices. It means the scan for the earth element with the breathing, and then the contemplation of the mental states, and the compassion. We abide in this condition of boundless compassion for as long as it seems suitable. We can sometimes tell that it's getting a little shaky, but if I let go, I can go a little longer. And then we can tell, oh, its time is over now. So not pushing it to stay longer than it wanted to stay, and instead moving over to contemplation of impermanence, taking the breath as the reference point, part of whole body awareness. And this awareness that we already cultivated earlier, the dependency of the body on the breath, makes that impermanence more clear. For some of us who like to work with more details, it is possible to analyze this experience of the impermanence of the breath in terms of the 5 aggregates. It's just an option. The body that is being breathed, the sensation of the breath, the perception if it's going in or out, the intention to stay with the breath or come back to the breath when the mind wanders off, and then this kind of knowing of all of these. These are the 5 aggregates. And sometimes it can just be of interest to use some more detail to really tease out the question of impermanence. But whether we do it in detail or simply, the main thing is for impermanence to lead on to dispassion, to lessening of attachments, to allow the flow of impermanence to wash away our attachments and defilements. And as I said briefly earlier when introducing the 4 steps of mindfulness of breathing, then from dispassion to cessation. Cessation in the sense of the being more at ease with the ending of things. And at this place, I think it would be good to also bring in a very clear understanding that we are talking about the ending of this body, recollection of death, and even the ending of human civilization. So the recommendation would be to use every inhalation, just not changing the inhalation, just a form of awareness. With every inhalation, being aware that I can't be sure, this could be my last breath. And with every exhalation, we relax and let go. The idea is that by using the inhalation and exhalation in this way, I can fine-tune the practice. When practice gets a little bit boring, like, I know I'm going to die, more inhalation, more intention on this, I might die the next breath. But if it's like, Oh, this is getting too much. Then more importance to the exhalation, just relaxing and letting go. Relaxing and letting go. In this way we can fine-tune the practice so it stays balanced. And as we come to be able to face the end of our own life, we can also learn to face the end of humanity. Just that knowledge that at some time in the future, all of the things we appreciate from human civilization will come to an end. There'll be no more Buddhism. Whatever we love of art, philosophy, whatever it is, it will all come to an end. And out of that we come to a very deep inner letting go. It is a letting go that in particular is a letting go of the three root poisons of greed, hate and delusion. And it is that kind of letting go that gives us a very strong inspiration to engage in doing whatever we can to counter the current ecological crisis. Thank you for your attention.